Okay, let's just get this out of the way right off the bat. Forget whatever you thought you knew about 19th century literature. Dostoevsky's classic isn't just some dusty, boring old murder mystery that you're forced to read in high school. It is actually a razor sharp, surgical dissection of the human conscience. And, a fascinating little aside, Dostoevsky actually wrote this while he was drowning in his own gambling debts, literally fighting off real life creditors, which honestly probably explains that overwhelming, palpable anxiety that just bleeds through every single page. So today in this explainer, we're diving into the architecture of guilt. We're going to look at how one author built a trap that is entirely, inescapably contained inside the human mind. Let's get into it. So we really have to start with this absolutely terrifying philosophical question. What if some people are simply above morality? And I don't mean, corrupt politicians or wealthy people who skirt the rules to get ahead. I mean truly, undeniably extraordinary people who fundamentally alter the entire course of human history. Think about the great conquerors or emperors who literally built entirely new civilizations, but did it on top of bloody battlefields. The question is, if someone creates a drastically better future for humanity, does it really matter how much blood is on their hands to get there? Dostoevsky drops this massive, heavy philosophical bomb right on our laps from the very beginning. All right, let's meet our main guy, Raskolnikov. He's a former student living in extreme, grinding poverty in the gloomy, oppressive streets of St. Petersburg. And man, he is just constantly spiraling in his own thoughts. His apartment is literally described as feeling like a coffin, which, as you can imagine, perfectly sets the stage for his deep detachment from reality. He is intensely paranoid, basically arguing with himself 24/7. But here is the most chilling part of all this. He's not plotting a murder out of some sudden fit of rage or even pure desperation. No, he is coldly and quietly calculating it. In that total, freezing isolation, his brain resorts to this deeply flawed, kind of terrifying, simple math. On one side of the scale, you have one single bad deed, right? Eliminating this old pawnbroker who he genuinely views as cruel, greedy, and just a parasite on society. But on the other side, hundreds of good deeds that could be funded by her stolen wealth? He is basically doing extreme moral accounting here. It's this incredibly dark, twisted version of utilitarianism where he is thoroughly convinced his own intellect that the mathematical good completely, 100% erases the moral evil of taking a human life. Now, what's really brilliant here is the pacing. If this were your standard, run-of-the-mill thriller, the murder would be the grand climax right at the very end. But Dostoevsky creates this intense narrative whiplash. He executes the crime shockingly early. We're talking roughly by page 100. Bam, it's done. The entire rest of this massive book actually has nothing to do with the physical act of murder or some traditional cat-and-mouse police chase. It is purely about the agonizing psychological fallout. He totally flips the crime genre on its head to show us what really happens after the blood is spilled and that initial adrenaline fades away. But we have to ask, where does a motive like that even come from? Well, before the events of the novel even take place, Raskolnikov actually published an article detailing what he calls the extraordinary man theory. He argues that historical giants, think of a massive figure like Napoleon Bonaparte, are inherently permitted to commit crimes. Why? Simply because they stand entirely above ordinary morality. In his mind, their sheer greatness and their destiny to reshape the world completely exempts them from the basic, everyday rules that govern the rest of us, normal folks. He looks around at historical hypocrisy, right? He sees emperors who are celebrated for starting massive wars, ordering brutal executions, causing just untold violence, all simply because they changed the world. And from that, he builds this twisted logic. Raskolnikov looks at this and thinks, okay, well, if extraordinary people create the new laws of society, why on earth should the old, ordinary laws apply to them? So, for Raskolnikov, this murder actually becomes a terrifying, real-world experiment to test his own hypothesis. It really boils down to the ultimate test. Is he an extraordinary man, or is he just, in his own harsh words, an ordinary louse? See, he doesn't actually care about the pawnbroker's money. That was honestly just a convenient excuse. He desperately needs to know if he has that absolute, cold-blooded psychological ruthlessness required to be a genius, or if he's just an ordinary, weak human being bound by conventional feelings of guilt. And you know what? On paper, it is the perfect crime. He gets in, commits the terrible act, and gets out. Nobody sees him do it, nobody catches him in the act. The police literally have zero hard evidence connecting him to the scene. By all conventional metrics of a criminal mind, he won. He beat the system. But as we're about to see, outsmarting the police turns out to be incredibly easy. Outsmarting yourself, that is completely impossible. Because right after the crime, this is where his mind begins just totally destroying itself from the inside out. Raskolnikov falls into this state of constant, unbearable panic. I mean, he becomes physically sick with violent fevers, he's plagued by these terrifying hallucinations, he can barely function in society. And the greatest irony of all? Those stolen goods that were supposed to fund his grand utilitarian future, he takes them and literally hides them under a random rock in a courtyard without even checking to see what they are worth. So much for funding the glorious future, right? It is a complete, total short circuit of his rational mind. To turn the heat up even more, Dostoevsky places Raskolnikov onto this incredibly complex psychological chessboard. Every single person he interacts with isn't just some background extra. They are deeply alive, and they represent completely different moral paths, different philosophies, and different potential outcomes for our protagonist. They practically surround him, forcing him to look at the shattered pieces of his own identity from every possible angle. It's brilliant how each character just systematically dismantles his cold ideology in real time. First, you have his friend Razumikin, warm, loyal, and entirely human. He's the exact opposite of Raskolnikov's freezing isolation. Then there's Sonia. She's been driven to prostitution by deep poverty, yet she remains completely compassionate and pure. She acts as the moral center that utterly disproves his cynical worldview. Then we have Porfiry, the investigator. He acts almost like an early version of Columbo, barely even threatening Raskolnikov with jail, but instead playing this intense game of psychological chess to dissect his soul. And finally, Svidrigailov, wealthy, completely amoral, yet deeply haunted. He represents the absolutely horrifying dark future waiting for Raskolnikov if he truly embraces the emptiness. Which brings us to the core of the explainer. Here is Dostoevsky's real answer. Raskolnikov's massive philosophical theory completely, totally collapses under the inescapable weight of his own conscience. The worst punishment imaginable isn't a physical prison cell, it's consciousness. Raskolnikov arrogantly thought guilt was just a weakness, right? A social construct for ordinary people. He genuinely thought his intellect could overpower human nature. But the one law you absolutely cannot escape is the one hardwired inside your own mind. His intellect told him murder was mathematically justifiable, but his humanity violently, physically rejects it. What blows my mind is just how profoundly modern this all feels. It perfectly describes emotional chaos wearing intellectual costumes. Dostoevsky understood over a century ago what modern psychology confirms today. We desperately, desperately want to believe we are rational creatures making entirely logical choices. But deep down, most of us are deeply emotional beings who simply use our intellect to justify our chaotic desires and our actions. Raskolnikov's grand, imposing theory of the extraordinary man was really just a sophisticated costume for a lonely, prideful, and suffering kid trying desperately to prove his own worth. Now, if the book just stopped at his mental collapse, it would honestly be a grim tragedy of pure nihilism. But it doesn't end with total destruction. Dostoevsky actually leaves us with the profound possibility of redemption. He shows us that the human spirit, no matter how corrupted by ideology or terrible actions, isn't permanently doomed. There is a way out of the mental prison, but here's the catch. It requires completely surrendering the exact pride that built the prison in the first place. And that perfectly answers our original question about greatness. The greatest people in history are not those who stand above morality. They're the ones capable of confronting themselves honestly. Crime and Punishment leaves us with this incredibly beautiful realization. No matter how smart you are, no matter how grand or flawless your personal theories seem, at the end of the day, you still have to wake up and live with yourself in the quiet of the night. So, I'll leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on. If the one inescapable prison in this life is our own consciousness, are you building a sanctuary in yours or a cell?